Mind, Crime, Liberty Show with me, Swithin Dobson, and him, Tim Patton. Today we discuss, are Oliver Cromwell and Ayn Rand right about Santa Claus? Tim, what on earth is this about?
Well, with Christmas coming up, I thought it'd be interesting to do a quote-unquote holiday-themed episode. And Ayn Rand is somewhat famous for liking Christmas. She celebrated Christmas, and she viewed it as a sort of celebration of capitalism and consumerism. Even though that her parents were like secular Jews from Russia, she used a joyous giving, and every place got beautifully decorated. This is from an article on the Ayn Rand Institute. This is Ayn Rand. The best aspect of Christmas is the aspects usually decried by the mystic. The fact that Christmas has been commercializing. The gift buying stimulates an enormous outspring of ingenuity in the creation of products devoted to a single purpose: to give man pleasure. So she was quite fond of Christmas, and I always thought that was interesting. Now, interestingly, there's another group of people who have the opposite view of Christmas, but in a way the same view as Ayn Rand, just much older, and that's the sort of Cromwell, Calvin, the Puritans in general. It's not quite clear, but Christmas was probably not celebrated in early America in any meaningful sense. Whether Cromwell actually did cancel Christmas in Britain, had the ability to do so in Parliament, is of some question here. So we can get into more of that here. But there's certain versions of the Protestants viewed Christmas as a kind of Catholic, made-up holiday that was inherited from the Roman Festivus tradition, and just full of a drunken orgy and feasting and getting decadence and a lot of other negative words you could throw at it. That's invented by the pagans and stuff. It's some sort of winter season. That's the general Catholic view, and certain Puritan Protestants would say, oh, Christ never was a part of Christmas. So I thought it would be interesting here to see if Swithin or anyone here and see what the general position of Christmas is. What is to be made of Christmas? Now it's kind of a consumer holiday. You could celebrate it even places like China, which is sort of a communist, post-capitalist dictatorship of some variety, if that even counts. You'll hear, if you go there, you'll see Disney, you'll see your Christmas songs being played in malls, you'll see Christmas trees and things of that matter. You'll see this in other countries. You'll see this in Taiwan, you see this in Japan, you'll see the Rudolph, the Santa Claus thing. And these are in non-Christian countries. So in a way, the Santa Claus, Rudolph type Christmas thing has gone around the world. Whether or not Christianity has, clearly it has not. So I thought it'd be interesting here to talk about Christmas. I have somewhat of a neutral view on Christmas at this point. As a kid, I liked it a lot, but I think a lot of it is just people are off from school. It's a sort of jailbreak holiday. That I liked it as a kid. I did believe in Santa Claus as a kid up to some point, but I'm not entirely sure. So, but to move on to that, go back to this question, Swithin, is Cromwell? I mean, this is the more intellectual academic point, right, about Christmas. Well, we might get to, if you want to hit Ayn Rand there too, but you have some interesting articles and points to make, Swithin.
Well, with respect to Cromwell and the festivities that took place at Christmas during his time in the 17th century, he may have been alive slightly earlier, it could well have been the case. Now, I'm not a huge historical expert at that time period, that the Christ, as it were, in Christmas was not too obvious, and that it was basically an excuse for a feast day and revelry and things, as you've outlined. It is certainly true that there were historic pagan festivals which took place around sort of quote-unquote Christmas time. That seems to certainly have been the case. So Saturnalia being the most famous from the Roman period. The question is whether or not the Christians started celebrating it just because, it was a hangover and they sort of Christianized Saturnalia or other sort of pagan festivals, or whether or not they actually had a distinct reason for celebrating as a Christian festival. On this note, there's an interesting article called The Myth of Pagan Christmas by Tom Holland, who argues that the main reason that the Christians started celebrating on that day was because in the the Christian scholars, drawing on the various sort of Jewish traditions and things, had come to the idea that Jesus was incarnated on the 25th of March. Now, the argument for this was essentially that's when he died, and that was somehow fitting that he would die on his, as it were, his incarnation. It wasn't his birthday, because he wasn't born, but when he was sort of assumed, as it were. And that for various reasons would be the date that he would have died, and he identified as the 25th of March. So basically on a 9-month pregnancy, you go back and you go, oh wait, well hang on, that means so he's assumed on the 25th of March, and that he was born on the 25th of December. I've also heard arguments as well from other sources that based on what they thought was the conjunction of Jupiter, which was supposed to be the star that the wise men for the east followed, was another reason why it was the 25th. So there definitely seems to be independent reason for the Christians to have a festival on that date. Now, whether it was sort of accepted by the locals as a festival on that date because it was just when they normally had such a festival is another question. But it certainly does seem to be different. And additionally, Tom Holland makes a distinct as point here with respect to Athelstan, who was, I believe, at least one of the first, if not the first, English, ruler of a large part of England. And one thing that he was required to do, he did on that sort of Christmas in 932, was that he gave lots of land grants, and he made sure the poor didn't go without shelter and sort of alms, because he saw it as his duty. So, for instance, as a quote, "My wish is that you should always provide the destitute with food." He very much had a concern for at least officially, a much greater concern for the poor than you would typically get in, say, Roman festivals. Now, there may have been an upending of hierarchy to some extent on Saturnalia and other sort of festivals, but it would go back to the natural order of things, as it were, after the feast day. But the way, at least as Tom Holland argues it, Athelstan had a very much more of a concept that the rich, for instance, had very much a greater obligation to the poor and needy than you would get traditionally in sort of Roman society. I have heard it argued in the past that sort of the problem of the poor is primarily a Christian invention, in a sense, because prior to that, no one particularly cared. So there do seem to be good grounds for thinking that the reason Christmas became a sort of Christian festival isn't just because it took over from Saturnalia, but rather there were independent grounds for doing so, and then it sort of had a Christmas feast, as it were. And again, it would make sense as a feast day because it was the birth of Jesus, so that second only to sort of Easter. So I mean, theologically, it makes sense. So I don't think it is just that. Now, as to how it was celebrated and why it was celebrated in particular ways, then yes, possibly that was revelry and sort of the lords of misrule and things. So in my readings before, it's like the idea of Father Christmas one of the first references to him is from Ben Jonson in the 17th century, an old man who's sort of like behind, who's organizing all the basic drunkenness and various things at Christmas. He's a sort of old fatherly figure. So that would I'd say about the sort of historical Christian aspects of it. Now, the question is whether it's sort of the consumerism, as you point out, is it today, or how much was it ever celebrated solely as a sort of like a Christian festival, or is it just an excuse for sort of quote unquote consumerism? Well, in one sense, I would say that one of the problems with the consumerism at Christmas is in the sense that it is not consumeristic enough. Now, what do I mean? Well, what I'm very interested theologically from Christmas is the affirmation that the material, the human, the flesh, as it were, is good, because otherwise Jesus wouldn't have been incarnated in a body. He would just be a spirit. So it's clear in the Christian theology that so the idea that you get from some of like the dualists is the material isn't bad, the material is kind of good. It's just that it's corrupted in various ways. And following on from that, this is later than sort of Christmas as such, that you have the death and physical resurrection of Jesus, again physicality, and then you have the creation of new heavens and new earth, Revelation 21. And again, Christian theology, at least as I think traditionally understood, has a very strong emphasis on the importance of the physical. And so, in a sense, then, I don't think that the consumerism per se is a bad thing, per se. In a sense, wanting lots of food and drink at Christmas is kind of a bit lame in comparison to having a new heaven and new earth. And I think that's a way I would sort of channel that, as it were, if you could consider it as a Christianization of contemporary consumerism. So if, from my perspective, consumerism as such, as it were, around Christmas is absolutely fine. You just need to remember what is, as it were, the ultimate consumer gift. Now, obviously, it's not consumer in the sense it would generally be used as consumer. But taking that in mind, I think it's absolutely fine. I mean, actually, Rand, looking at stuff on Rand as to why she liked Christmas, was basically an aesthetic thing. She thought that, things were decorated beautifully and people took care and pride in what they produced. And I think, well, yeah, that's clearly good. And so in a way, the reasons Rand liked Christmas, I agree with her in a sense. So I suppose I may have a somewhat idiosyncratic view with respect to Christmas, but I kind of think that Rand is. I think the Puritans and certain Protestants have underplay the importance of sort of the physical and the material, and I think that covers their view of Christmas and other sort of feast day type thing. So those would be my sort of broad overall thoughts to begin with.
Before I retouch the consumer point, I want to make a redefense of the Puritans and the Calvinists here with respect to Christmas. I think there's a certain sense which, and I'm sympathetic to, I think there's a certain sense which the Christians, the Puritans, believe in some kind of angry God. You get, the Edwards guy, sinners in the hand of an angry God. And they just view these certain holidays as incompatible with, this sort of feasting and drunkenness. Of course, the heirs of the Puritans created prohibition and things like that matter, or various other sects like that. We've discussed this on the show as well. So I think from their reading of, and that's actually to some extent my reading in a sense of, in particularly certain aspects of the Old Testament here, and sort of the Paul's Testaments here, the Pauline stuff. I think they view it sort of as fundamentally angry. Peter Thiel and T. Wright had a little interesting conversation. He said that Peter Thiel commented, the trouble is when the opposite sides of the culture wars agree on things, like God is really angry, so of course his son would be kind of angry. And, how could you have a holiday like this joyous here? Because Easter, in a way, is a much more dour holiday, at least most of it leading up to it. Easter itself is joyous, but even there, in a way, the Puritans have a habit of turning everything to dour occasions here, for better or for worse here. So I think that would be my defense of it. With respect to consumerism, I do think it's interesting because you get these somewhat left-wing Christians and certain versions of right-wing Christians who could criticize capitalism, who will make the same point. They just don't like all the buying, they don't like all the presents, they don't like all the consumer spending. As far as that point is concerned, I'm sympathetic to both sides here. I think there are fine people on both sides here of this issue. I do think middle class and above families probably have. I sound like they have a lot of stuff. They have a lot of cheap stuff. I think kids one of the troubles with having too many cheap toys is kids don't really care about them per se. I've noticed that experience generally. So I do think present giving, there's a sort of upper bound it's like a U curve where you have really cheap gifts that are great or really expensive gifts. You get in the middle of the curve, it gets sort of weird. So you should have to be. It's a constantly, you have to increase the dosage of presents to get the same effect. So I do think present giving can get tricky here. And present giving also, we just talk a lot about economics here, is also interesting because gifts in a way have gifts that aren't exactly equal are in a way a form of patronage or spoilage, depending on what you think. So parents will give gifts to their children here, but in a way it's like a capital investment almost, or like patronizing or grandparents will give to their or spoiling in a way. So I do think there are some interesting dilemmas at play here with gift giving. And I think if you sort of go back to many people's first principle ethical positions, certain aspects can be dodgy. So Swithin, what do you make of my redefense of the Puritans here, my dour point, as well as the general gift giving thing with respect to consumerism? Do the critics of consumerism have a point, or do you think Ayn Rand is right here?
Well, I think that with the presents and things, I mean, yes, you can clearly go overboard, and clearly you've got to sort of there are certain people who go into massive amounts of debt at Christmas because they try and spend way more than they can afford to spend. And as ever, there's the possibility to have sort of the vice of excess, as it were, me wanting to go to my golden mean again here. And I think if you could argue a lot of people do go to excess, especially sort of financially, and they buy things they don't need or they don't really want. And the interesting thing with children is, I thought the point you were going to make economics is the idea that you shouldn't ever sort of give people gifts. What you should do is give them money so they buy things they want, because the probability that they're going to buy something they'll probably like something they buy themselves more than something that someone bought for them, because they will buy things that they like. Well, they'll have more information about what they would like than somebody else does, and therefore.
Let me quickly respond to that. I was going to make that point. Tyler Cowen 100% agrees with you that point that you give them money, but Tyler Cowen sometimes has interesting debates with himself here. And one response that I liked that he made was that, and this is sort of like the benefits of gift giving is you don't exactly. It's harder to know about the exact price of the good, although you can sort of guess, as well as it hides the layers of sort of crass economic exchange. Because, like I said, gift giving that's imbalanced here. Like, so if you give a gift if you give an iPhone 13 and all you gave them was a $20 gift card, is a huge imbalance here. So there's a certain economic inefficiency, so to speak, to gift giving that's balanced. Because why not just keep the money? Why go out and find $1,000 good to make up for the $1,000 good to give back to you? I do think there's a sort of quote unquote economic efficiency, but that sort of is sort of the nature of human relations here. But that'd be my quick response there. Sorry to interrupt.
Oh no, yeah, I actually agree. I don't actually think that that giving money is actually a good idea per se, because I think it ignores the value of somebody thinking to get something for you that you think they will like, and there's the anticipation you don't know necessarily what it's going to be, and so there is value to that. And also, when you give money, for instance, that's something that they can choose to spend on something they want, or they could just save it. Whereas giving a physical object is actually sort of a gift, and a lot of sort of some Christian leftists and Marxists talk about gift economies and things. And at least psychologically, it seems that if you buy someone a gift, you're sort of like psychologically in their debt. You're indebted to the gift giver, and it improves sort of social bonds over and above what would be a purely sort of financial transaction. So I think gift giving is kind of good. That said, of course, people can buy bad gifts, and it is helpful if people produce lists of general ideas and things, so you have kind of guidance as to what they should get you, but not something exactly there, so you definitely know what you're going to get. So there's some like middle ground between, oh yeah, I'm not sure what it is, but it's probably going to be good. That seems to, and then seems to be good. So that's a good middle ground, and plus it sort of builds sort of social bonds in the way that gifts seem to do. Whether they should do that's another question. It just seems to be the fact that they do that. Could you just remind me very briefly of your defense of the Puritans? Because I've kind of gone off track on the consumerism stuff.
The Puritans, and I get this from Peter Thiel and N.T. Wright conversation here. The Puritans is sort of a dour view, angry view. And Jonathan Edwards said, "Sinners in the hands of an angry God."
Oh,
it's not,
right, yeah.
Christmas seems, if your view of Christ and God is basically angry, the whole idea of Christmas is clearly abiblical, if not unbiblical, with respect to that.
That makes sense. I mean, that does make sense. But I think that's sort of a misreading of the Old Testament to a large extent. I mean, so for instance, a lot of, now I'm not defending prosperity gospel type stuff, but they would tend to point to men of the Old Testament who are men of God, and they're blessed by God with physical stuff. I mean, a good example is Job. Job is an astonishingly rich man. Even if you think he's a sort of an allegorical figure and not necessarily literally historical, that's irrelevant really for the point here. The point is, well, he's a man of God, and he gives loads of sheep, and he owns loads of stuff, and he's blessed after the end of his sort of the trials of Job. So the idea that God doesn't sort of like give sort of graciously and abundantly sort of like in the Old Testament before is sort of is I think a misreading of it, and is very much a narrow focus, and actually does relate to it theologically. One of the problems I think with a lot of sort of reform types is they seem to start everything, their view of the world on the fall. That's it. The fall is west is the beginning. It's like, kind of there's a few chapters before that in Genesis when stuff is made good, and so I think, again, not to go to golden mean stuff again, in the Bible, there's very much the idea of God graciously giving abundantly to his people. I mean, the idea was Israel was supposed to be like the land of this great land of milk and honey. I think that's the right term. This great place where God would bless his people and physically abundant. And that's kind of the thing that you wouldn't think that sort of the sinner and the angry God would necessarily do. But I think it's the idea really that you get very much God in the Bible is very extreme, insofar as you could view him as extremely gracious and beneficent in certain respects, but also extremely sort of austere and vengeance is probably unfair, but very much focused on justice, as it were, and sort of like punishing the sinner. And I think that you get both biblically, and I think the reform types and the Puritans tend to err on focusing not just on sort of like the punishment aspect and not kind of on the grace stuff. Although to be fair, they'll go on about the theology of grace all the time, but it kind of never really seems that they enjoy anything. They just seem, well, apart from sort of immiserating themselves. That's where they sort of get the joy. So theologically, that's where I'd say the problem with certain, not all, but certain sort of views of sort of certain reform figures and Puritan-ish figures can do.
So one of the words being included here, I would agree here, and to some extent, one of the characters being included here was Santa Claus in our title. What is to be made of Santa Claus here? You get the classic line, it's you see on these posters here, at least I imagine they're in Britain too, Jesus is the reason for the season or something like that. And again, I've always in the back of my head ever since I've heard about the fact that the Puritans sort of viewed Christmas as a decadent Catholic holiday. I always chuckled when I saw that because like maybe it was never about it. But I can see both sides of this argument here. But what do you make about Santa Claus? You've read a little bit into the history of it. Where did he come from here? And should people believe in him? I'll make a quick aside before you get where the come from aspect. But Slavoj Zizek, there's an obscure clip of him on the internet a while back when I was working for a more boring job. I used to listen to a lot of different thinkers, and I listened to all the works of Zizek here. And one of them discussion was on Santa Claus here. And Santa Claus, interestingly enough, for Zizek, is sort of a thing where, everyone's a cynic here at some point. The kids believe in Santa Claus because they want to get presents. The parents want to believe in the Santa Claus because they want to give them presents. And also Santa Claus is a sort of means of control. If you go to the mall or you go any restaurant, you'll hear there'll be no Christmas or Santa Claus won't come. You'll get coal in your stockings. So there's a way that Santa Claus functions as a reward system, and it's sort of, again, a way to give gifts here. It's an occasion for giving gifts. But before we get into those points about should we believe in Santa Claus, where did Santa Claus come from? How did we get him? Didn't it start out with some like St. Nicholas character?
Yeah, Santa Claus does start with St. Nicholas. Just as an aside, in England, for instance, we would tend to call him Father Christmas as opposed to Santa Claus, although in more recent years, the American cultural imperialism would mean he's more sort of Santa Claus now than Father Christmas as such. But as mentioned before, Father Christmas is this sort of old figure who organised revelries, comes from sort of like, at least recorded one of the earliest ones from Ben Jonson play in the early 17th century. The Santa Claus who later comes into the 19th century, that's really, the late 19th century is sort of where the sort of tradition is sort of cemented that we sort of have now. Originates from, as I said, St. Nicholas. There was, so you have the legend of Sinterklaas, St. Nicholas, and according to English Heritage article on this, that St. Nicholas was a 4th century Greek bishop from Myra, noted, I think, for punching an Arian heretic in one of the councils. And he's associated with a wide variety of miracles. Apparently, one, he resurrected 3 youths after being murdered and pickled in a barrel by an innkeeper. Apparently, as well, he gave dowries to a poor man to prevent his selling his own daughters into slavery. Apparently, so he, under the cover of darkness, he threw 3 bags of gold down the chimney, and the gold landed in their stockings, which were drying by the fire. And then throughout the Middle Ages, St. Nicholas's fame spreads throughout continental Europe. So in Germany, and I think also in Holland, there's the idea of like Nicolastag, Nicholas's Day, where the gifts are left for children on the 6th of December. And this is the sort of origin of sort of like the gift giving type stuff. And then I think the Americans then sort of changed sort of St. Nicholas into sort of Santa Claus. According quotes here, in 1773, the Rivington Gazette in New York reported that the anniversary of St. Nicholas, otherwise called Santa Claus, had recently been marked by a great number of the sons of that ancient saint. And so that's kind of where Santa Claus sort of comes from. And then the argument here is he then gets his beard and all these other accoutrements in the 19th century, where the Victorian people, and again, sort of similarly culturally in certain respects in America, you were trying to sort of domesticate Christmas. Christmas is more towards like family orientated and more towards children, rather than sort of adult sort of revelry and drunkenness and debauchery, etc. And so then became sort of like fat, old, sort of jolly old grandfatherly figure. And I say he kind of comes over into England, and Father Christmas kind of gets merged with St. Nicholas. And then you get the standard sort of view of sort of Father Christmas in England, as it were, from sort of like the Victorian era, which is a way of sort of like making Christmas sort of like more family friendly, effectively. And that's sort of the general sort of, this is consistent with a lot of things I've read before. So that just seems to be sort of like consistent with the view of, well, that's a way of looking at where he came from, which seems to be reasonably accurate. So that's sort of the idea. So As to when he started dropping presents on the 25th the 24th of December rather than the 25th, apparently that starts, the dropping on the 25th comes from an old anonymous illustrated poem in the US, Old Santa Claus of Much Delight. And this is when he gets his red coat and reindeer and sleigh, and 1821 this is, and then he just somehow appears on Christmas Eve. Now, as to why he comes on Christmas Eve, probably because it links nicely with sort of Christmas, and again, it's a way of bringing this nice child-friendly aspect to the Christmas day itself, as opposed to that being on this day on St. Nicholas Day on the 6th, that's the kids, all the good stuff for the adults on the 25th. So that's a general overview.
As far as belief in Santa Claus is concerned, I'm agnostic with Christian leanings to some extent, actually more extent to some ways. But should Christians teach their children in Santa Claus? Is this a dangerous precedent to do? Is the belief in Santa Claus fundamentally weird? Weird as in strange. I mean, this guy lives in the North Pole. He flies around. One of the things that the politically correct crowd will point out is that, quote unquote, poor people can't believe in Christmas because everyone knows that it's your parents who buys them since they don't get as nice of gifts. That's a point that sort of left-wing Christians types will make with respect to Santa Claus here. So I'm sort of interested in that. Will the politically correct people come from Santa Claus? I think they eventually will come from Santa Claus or try to go after him or change him in a way. But that's another sort of interesting in there. So Swithin, should people teach? I mean, what's your own experience? What is your experience in the broader society? Too much you want to give or not give out?
Well, when it comes to Father Christmas, I'm not necessarily go out of my way to inculcate belief in that in my children. They get the idea that he might be real, which is perfectly fine. I don't particularly mind. I suppose from a parental view is the question of whether it sort of, as it were, constitutes a lying. Although whether you could argue it's some sort of like enacted sort of theatrical sort of performance of Christmas as such is another question. So is believing kind of weird? I suppose from modern perspective, believing in something like that is weird, but I think historically, I think that would have been less so. Because, you have the idea of spirits and nymphs and fairies and things, which are relatively widely believed. I think it's only seems particularly strange in the concept of in the context of scientific materialism. That's when he becomes fundamentally strange. Otherwise, this guy comes from Christmas fine. I mean, to take another view, there was the mindset of it. It's just true. I listened to in the context of the medieval period. There was these weird, strange creatures that people claim they saw. And the first response to this wasn't, well, did they exist? But rather, were they human? So should we evangelize them? That was kind of like the response. It wasn't whether they in fact existed. So this sort of general skepticism for sort of the, don't want to say supernatural, but beyond sort of the normal, is very much, I think, a sort of post 18th, 19th century concern more than anything else.
So Swithin, you're calling Santa Claus an alien.
Well, the interesting thing you say that is aliens are the acceptable form of sort of like the supernatural. As an aside, we discussed it a number of times. Alex Jones. Alex Jones basically believes that the elites are Satanists and, well, basically are aided by demons. But he no longer calls them demons anymore. He now calls them interdimensional aliens, because that has more credence, because, as it were, science fiction has a lot more credence with modern contemporary man than does sort of supernatural, you could sound like horror fiction, as it were, despite horror fiction being quite popular anyway. So yes, you could consider him in kind of the contemporary worldview. Yeah, Santa Claus, Father Christmas is very much best viewed as an alien more than anything else. I do think that's true.
He flies around. He has elves, it matches the description to some extent.
Yeah, and you could say he's sort of like a time traveler as well, because he does everything in this short period of time. Where everyone, it appears to us to be a short period of time, but actually maybe a long period of time for him, because he can get around and do everything. Because obviously he goes around the entire world and gives everyone presents. So yeah, he is an interesting figure in that respect. But I would say that children, like, you could argue that children have a somewhat pantheistic view of the world innately. They seem to see personhood and sort of everywhere in the world, rather than, oh, it's just matter in motion. It has some sort of like genuine sort of being. So the idea that, oh, it could be this guy out there who is doing all this stuff is kind of not that unreasonable. So, for instance, children make faces out of everything, give them sort of like a personality. So you get like your chips and your, I don't know if you have fish fingers in America or things like that, and then they like turn it into a face. Or you give children like chips which are basically shaped in faces. Yeah. They're very much the idea that everything in the world is kind of personal, and it's out, and things that are out there that exist, which are sort of like beyond human but have some like personal element to them, isn't entirely unreasonable, at least from a child perspective. And the child generally deals in fictions all the time, in sort of play and things. So it's I don't think it's necessarily an unhealthy belief, not one that I don't think the parents necessarily should go all out to inculcate and believe is literally true. But I don't see that. I don't see it per se as any sort of problem, and if anything, is probably quite healthy in certain respects. As to whether the left will come for Santa, I think they will, because obviously he gives different people different amounts of presents. They'll have to change they'll just have to replace his face with Karl Marx instead, and so give everybody equal presents. That would be, I imagine, an obvious move with that respect. So, yeah, the left will definitely come after him at some point if they haven't already. And yeah, Santa Claus is fine. I have no objection to it.
Well, the sort of mold-bugging neo-reactionaries would agree with you that they'll eventually come after him, because they sort of interpret them as this. They interpret them as sort of one long line of the same thing. So I think that's interesting. Final point here: what do you make of Christmas with respect to? I want to retouch the present giving. What would be the ideal? I haven't sort of rehearsed this question here, but I've been thinking about it. What would be the ideal present giving here with respect in general here? Is it the same amount? Is it more? From the articles you gave me on these origins here, it actually originated from I think European monarch, British monarch here that started this sort of what we see as present giving here. Now, of course, you take the Marxist Graeber line. They and actually, for the matter of Rothbard, they steal the servants' wealth and they give it back to them as gifts. But anyway, not less cynically here, what in general, if you could, sketch out a model here, would be contra Tyler Cowen, contra the economic efficientizers, it probably does have a somewhat useful thing here. But the funny thing is, if I give you a $20 gift card, you give me a $20. Well, gift cards. If I give you 20 euros, you give me 20 euros or whatever. I don't know why I said euros. Pounds. In a way, it's sort of a neutral trade. It makes no sense here. You just sort of toss $20 back and forth. There may be a joke that appeared in a movie like that. I think it was with cheap sweaters or something like that. But what is the economic basis under here, Swithin?
So just to clarify, are you primarily thinking about if someone gives you something, should you give them back something of equal value, or
greater, or less,
or greater? Oh, okay, yeah. So.
Or am I just being overly economically autistic?
No. I mean, people certainly do feel the obligation to do that. If somebody has more money than they do, and they give them a gift, and it clearly has great value, they kind of think, well, this is what I'm saying is, this is why some people don't like getting gifts. Actually, is because they feel like they're indebted to somebody who gives them. and some people don't like feeling in debt to anybody, especially if they don't think that they can repay it. So some people dislike being given something of great value if they can only give something of little value to somebody else. Now, on a very basic level, in a certain sense, you could never give someone a gift of equal value. Well, no, actually, no, you could. No, I was thinking here of the idea of any voluntary exchange. Both parties must value each item differently, one higher, one lower, otherwise it would never trade. But so you could, in principle, do that. Although how you work that out is another question. So you could give it. I think it depends on how much income you have. I mean, if somebody is a lot richer than you, then I think it's perfectly reasonable for them to give you something of significantly higher value than you can return to them. Now, the main difficulty there is for the poor man to try and find something that the rich man doesn't have and can be of value to him. I think that's where maybe sort of like personalized presents or things that the individual who sort of created themselves, for instance, and that's kind of something that they could do. I mean, so for instance, I mean, this was just a card and an example I did. So I did sort of like a Game of Thrones inspired birthday card for my wife, which had sort of her in as sort of like a character. It's not necessarily as elaborate as it sounds, but you could do things like that. And even though it doesn't have that great monetary value, it kind of shows dedication and sort of is valued by the recipient, even though it might not have huge exchange value. I think as well, I think some people's aversions to getting gifts of differential value is an egalitarianism. If somebody, so for instance, if I was really rich, which I'm not, and if anyone wants to make me rich, please make me rich. That's fine. I wouldn't think that I need people to give me gifts of equal value that I bestowed on them. So that's nice to give. One of the nice to is appreciate they help them out, and I can give you lots of stuff that you like. But I would have no expectation that they give me something of greater value. I think that's a more modern egalitarian thing. I mean, when you have sort of, you mentioned Athelstan, they have very much like the noblesse oblige, and like, well, okay, they have more, and so you should just bestow more. And the peasantry shouldn't really be expected to sort of do much less of being given a gift, and you don't need to give anything back. That's fine. Now, of course, you could argue, economically speaking, they're sort of being expropriated and various things like that. But even assuming they weren't, I still think that dynamic is not necessarily unhealthy. But the basic thing is, when it comes to presents, is figuring out what you can reasonably afford and go with that. But I think what tends to happen is people who are friends and family, they tend to be of similar economic station, and that's where you get the idea that you get more of an equality of presence, as it were, rather than an inequality. So to what extent the inequality, and I'm highlighting here, is going to be likely is another question. But I do think inequality in sort of gift giving is perfectly fine and kind of good in certain respects, because it would kind of be weird that someone who's really rich only gave like a really small value present because the poor man could only give a small value present to the rich man. That would seem strange and be looking at things from too much of like an abstract view rather than looking at your sort of specific finances and situation and what can you reasonably afford, what would be, as I say, just. It's kind of a weird concept, use the word just, or what would be reasonable in that situation. So those are some overall thoughts I would have with respect to appropriate sort of gift giving.
Well, that's really my final comment / question here. I'll make a short concluding statement. What's interesting here is how I said in the earlier part that Ayn Rand, being secular, likes Christmas, and the sort of the Cromwell types dislike Christmas here. And even in the gift giving gets complicated here, and it's sort of, as you say, the politics of gift giving get complicated here because people are in a way fundamentally unequal. Now, whether that's because of society or whether that's because of other factor. So even gift giving. So, if you listen to sort of left-wing anarchist economists like a David Graeber, I've been working through his works recently, gift giving, which is what their ideal they want, and sort of Christmas represents, itself has a sort of problematic undertone here, which is one of the reasons why I asked you the question about, will the left come for Santa Claus? I think actually they will, although I don't know. It's unclear here. Maybe to each his own necessity or something like that. So overall, I would say that I'm somewhat of a curmudgeon towards Christmas in a sense here, because I do think certain, because like certain Catholics of the right, sort of traditional types, will on the one hand be against consumerism but like Christmas, and you get the Protestants who like consumerism but don't actually like Christmas that much, and you get all sorts of random variations here. So I think Christmas is interesting, to say the least. But I guess we should have more Rand and less Cromwell maybe towards Christmas. And since I'm releasing this episode roughly around Christmas, Merry Christmas or Happy Christmas or whatever you want to say, or maybe it's Get Out Wicked or Drunken Orgy, so saith Calvin. Swithin?
As I sort of outlined, I think the approach is the appropriate one is a sort of like a fusing of sort of Randianism, Randian approach to Christmas with traditional Christian theology of Christmas, is it were the golden mean. We want lots of Christ and lots of stuff. You don't have to choose, and having both is the optimal thing. Obviously, there's a rank order of preference, but if you put Christ front and center and you get lots of stuff, all for the better, and that's the way I would go with that. Just now, I'd like to thank everyone for listening. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please share it with your friends and family. And please subscribe to us on Podbean and YouTube. The more subscribers we get, the higher we get in search rankings, and the more people can access this material. And if you'd like to contact the show for any reason, please contact at mindcrimelibertyshow@gmail.com. That's mindcrimelibertyshow@gmail.com.